Hello everyone. So in this video, I want to try to explain to you how a country called South Sudan, located in the eastern parts of Africa, ended up having 6 presidents. The president, first vice president, and 4 other vice presidents. Now I know this is a setting that is not, common in many countries. And you find that when something of this kind happens, it only happens under some circumstances. So in this video, I'm going to try to explain to you how this country called South Sudan, the youngest country in the world, ended up having all these presidents who are currently serving the country. There are 6 presidents in the country right now as I speak. 1 president, first vice president, and 4 other vice presidents. That is South Sudan for you. Now, to understand this, how the country South Sudan ended up with this number of presidents, the story can be dated back in the year 2011. So South Sudan gained its independence on the 9th of July 2011 from the then Sudan. So Sudan used to be one country, but then in 2011 January, the country went for a referendum that actually made the southern part of the country to separate away from the Sudan. And therefore, South Sudan became an independent state on July 9, 2011, making it the world's newest or the world's youngest country. 14 years old, I think, so I speak of today. Now, after South Sudan gained independence in 2011, just after 2 years, in 2013, there emerged conflict, a civil war, where the southern part of the country, or South Sudan itself, fought. And the civil war was mainly because of the politicians or the political figures. They developed some suspicion within the presidency. By that time, we had Salva Kiir Mayardit, who was the president of the country, and his deputy, who is Riek Machar. They started developing some suspicion. The president leaked some information that the vice president was actually trying to plot a coup against his government. And as a result, the president immediately responded by making a cabinet reshuffle. He sacked his entire cabinet, removing the vice president and other top members of the cabinet and military generals. And because the cabinet by that time that was formed in 2011 was actually a composition of military leaders or liberation fighters, those who fought for the independence of their country. They composed the entire government. So in 2013, when President Salva Kiir leaked that there was a plot against his government made by the vice president or the deputy president by that time, Riek Machar, what he did was he responded by sacking the entire cabinet. As I said, he removed the vice president, Riek Machar, and all other top cabinet ministers who were linked to actually him plotting the coup. And as a result, what happened was that after some few months, the vice president was angry and he had to defect, actually went to the bush and came back, fought the government or fought the president. And when the fight started, the president and his team actually arrested some of the top cabinet ministers who were linked to be part of Machar's team. So they were arrested and detained. So I think most of them were detained in Kenya, Nairobi. So they later became what we call the former detainees. The former detainees, which actually later would be formed one of the major functions to the peace agreement or to the unity government that is existing now. So after the war broke out, in 2014, a negotiation started. And therefore, in 2015, a peace deal was signed and Machar was called back to come and again assume his role as the vice president. So Machar came back to Juba, he was made the vice president, and again after a few months, fight started again in the country, and that made the vice president Machar to actually flee the country. He left through the Democratic Republic of Congo, and he left the country. Again, the country went back into war. So as the country was fighting, there was already three major functions here. One, we had the SPLM in government. And just to tell you one more thing is that the SPLM is the major political party in the country, called the Sudan People Liberation movement. It was the party that actually fought for the independence of the country. It attained the independence, and therefore most of the leaders were part of the SPLM party. But until 2013, when the party used to be one until Vice President Machar defected and formed his own party called the Sudan People Liberation Movement in opposition, SPLM opposition. But also, as we had two major functions, the SPLM mainstream and then the Sudan People Liberation Movement in opposition, there also emerged what we call the political detainees or the former political detainees. These are senior top members of the cabinet who were not actually allied to Machar or allied to Kir. They were actually advocating for reforms within the SPLM party. They didn't buy the idea of the SPLM party splitting into two, but all they were calling for is reforms within the SPLM party. And they also became a different part towards the peace agreement that we will talk about later. And as the fighting continues, I mean, there were efforts made by international community, IGAD, and all other partners to actually bring all these parties together and form a comprehensive or a peace agreement that will actually yield fruits. Efforts were made, and then later on, in 2018, Machar was actually requested to come to Ethiopia, and they started making peace agreements. And the peace agreement that was started in 2017 and concluded in 2018 was actually a composition of different functions. One, we had the SPLM party or the mainstream, which is actually called the SPLM in government. We have the SPLM-IO, which is the Sudan People Liberation Movement in opposition under Machar. We have the former detainees. These were the top political leaders who were arrested because they were linked to the incident that happened in 2019. They later became part of the peace agreement. And also we have some other opposition parties who were not actually linked to any, called the South Sudan Opposition Alliance. And then again, there were other opposition political parties. They were a small group of people who were led by some small military leaders who actually terrorizing some of the communities. And they also became a different part of that peace agreement, a different function. And the idea was that the negotiating bodies or those who were helping in the negotiation of the peace agreement, they really didn't want to leave any functions apart, because if they're not included to be part of the peace agreement, they were seeing that they're going to be again war. These people would go and fight in other parts of the country, which wouldn't be good. So the idea was they wanted to bring everybody in so that they can have like a unity government established so that the country doesn't go back to war. So in 2018, what happened was that these functions were all actually brought into the table, and they started negotiating. And when the negotiation was reached, when the peace agreement was reached, it was resolved that South Sudan will have what we call a unity government, a revitalized government, I mean a transitional government of national unity, which comprises all the functions. And this government would actually lead the country until elections time, so that the country can actually get its president and vice president, which is different from the current formation. So during the peace agreement, it was reached that the president of the country will come from the SPLM mainstream. The first vice president will come from the SPLM-IO, who is the vice president, Machar. And then we'll also have 4 other vice presidents. The other vice president will come from the former detainees who were arrested. And then another one will come from the South Sudan Opposition Alliance. These are people, other political parties were not linked to all parties. And then also we'll have 2 other vice presidents appointed from the Transitional Government of National Unity. So the Transitional Government of the National Unity was the one that was formed before the 2018 peace agreement. Of course, it comprises all the other functions. But then when the agreement was reached finally in 2018, the parties agreed that they will have 6 presidents. The president, who happens to come from the SPLM mainstream, the first vice president that happens to come from the Sudan People Liberation Movement in opposition, who should be Riek Machar, and would have another vice president coming from the former detainees, and it should be a woman. That's why we're having Rebecca Nyandeng, or the wife to the former liberation fighters, John Garang, who is a vice president. And also it was proposed that the country would also have another vice president who comes from the South Sudan Opposition Alliance, and then also other 2 vice presidents from the Transitional Government of National Unity. So this is how the country actually happened to have 6 presidents right now. As I speak, the country has 6 presidents. The president of the Republic of South Sudan, who is none other than Salva Kiir Mayardit, who happens to come from the SPLM mainstream. We have the first vice president of the country, who is Dr. Riek Machar Teng, who happens to come from the SPLM IO. We have the vice president for gender and youth affairs, who is Mama Nyandeng, who happens to come from the former political detainees. We have a vice president named Josephine Lagu, who comes from the South Sudan Opposition Alliance, and then 2 other vice president who comes from the transitional government of national unity. So this is how South Sudan ended up having 6 presidents.